speech, argued that free speech is actually undesirable since it drowns meritorious works, such as his novels, presumably, in a sea of vulgarity, a category to which he relegated the Danish cartoons. The former head of the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation agreed with him, complaining in an op-ed about how the Western world has made free speech sacred. He found it scary, that was his word, scary, that some people might actually fight for the right to speak their minds. The world is changing, he wrote. It always has been. Sacred things come and go, unquote. In other words, freedom is a fad, shake it off, move on. In recent months, attacks on freedom by the Norwegian elite have only intensified. First, there was a serious attempt to strengthen the blasphemy law. More recently, there have been calls to rewrite the Norwegian constitution to include multicultural protections for the rights of groups, a change which would involve setting limits on debate and punishing those who offend religious sensibilities. A leading Oslo publisher has suggested that we should, quote, let go of the idea that our hard-won right to offend, wound, and insult our fellow man is a good thing, close quote. Jan Erik Smilden, a former Middle East correspondent for the newspaper Dagbladet, has written that, quote, free speech is an important principle, but it has its limits. In recent years, this very sentiment has been expressed in the Western media by a long list of leading cultural figures. So intense is the pressure to take this sort of position that it wasn't until he was diagnosed with terminal cancer that an environmental activist named Steinar Lem, one of Norway's most outspoken leftist intellectuals, dared to publicly address the threat that the growth and appeasement of fundamentalist Islam in Norway pose to values like sexual equality, respect for gay people, and the right to criticize religion. This man, who had always seemed a fearless advocate of the causes closest to his heart, admitted that he hadn't spoken up earlier, for one reason and one reason alone. He was scared of alienating his fellow environmentalists and intellectuals. That was last April. He died 3 weeks later. Excuse me for talking so much about Norway, but it is a country that I've come to love. It has become my home, and it is chilling to see it destroying itself right before my eyes. I love Norway too. I love the Netherlands too. And there are many places in Europe that I've come to love. But I've seen across the whole continent that multiculturalism has reaped what it has sowed. The killer of Theo van Gogh was born and bred in Amsterdam. London's 7/7 terrorists were, as the media put it, British lads. Is it any surprise that the children and grandchildren of immigrants, young people raised in a society suffused with a multicultural disdain for its own liberties, tell pollsters in staggeringly high numbers that they would like to see Sharia law in Europe? After all, the people whose lessons about the world they've taken in over the years in mosques and religious schools and Islamic community centers, the people whom they've read on Islamist websites and watched on Al Jazeera and other satellite channels, know what they believe in and stand for. The Al-Qaradawis of this world are not relativists. They aren't multiculturalists. They have a goal and a vision and a determination and a sense of identity and values that Western multiculturalists don't. And they know it. And therein lies their strength. Since 9/11, there have been a number of moments of truth. But in my view, the episode of the Danish cartoons was perhaps the critical moment for the struggle of freedom in the West against Islam and its multicultural appeasers and enablers. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with at least the general outlines of the story. After an editor at the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten learned that the illustrators in his country were scared to draw pictures of Muhammad for an innocuous children's book, he solicited and published drawings of Muhammad by a dozen different cartoonists. Thanks to a concerted international effort by Danish Muslim leaders who were determined to pressure the Danish government into apology and appeasement, their cartoons gained the attention of the world. And in a vivid demonstration of the fact that the appeasement of Islam is not an exclusively left or right-wing phenomenon, the cartoons were condemned by both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, by the Washington Post and the New York Times on the left and the Wall Street Journal on the right, by The Nation and the National Review, by Fox News and CNN. Very few places, very few publications even reprinted their cartoons, which they might have done out of solidarity with their colleagues at Jyllands-Posten, or simply to show the general public what all the fuss was about. In fact, only one major newspaper in the United States, the Philadelphia Inquirer, ran the cartoons, while here in Canada they were published, as far as I know, only in the Jewish Free Press and the Western Standard, both of which were reported to the Alberta Human Rights Commission for doing so. In Europe, to their credit, a few major newspapers reprinted their cartoons, though in all of Britain, not a single newspaper did so. And in Norway, the editor of a tiny Christian newspaper reprinted them, but after a couple of weeks of extreme pressure by people at the very highest levels of the Norwegian government, he caved in and, under the auspices of the Norwegian government, apologized to a roomful of imams for having exercised what he had mistakenly thought was his inalienable right to publish what he wished. In the wake of their shameful and craven response to the Danish cartoons, the Western media and Western leaders have only grown increasingly willing to trim fundamental freedoms to placate jihadists. Again, this is not and should not be seen as a matter of left and right. If many on the left view the criticism of Islam as a violation of the multicultural precept that we in the West have no right to say anything negative about another culture, many people on the Christian right are loath to insult fellow people of faith and thereby invite unwelcome scrutiny of their own religion. And for many people on both sides of the political spectrum, this is, of course, quite simply a matter of fear. And there's yet another factor. Some of you may have followed the recent controversy surrounding a forthcoming book from Yale University Press about the Danish cartoons, a book in which it was announced that the cartoons themselves, absurdly, would not appear. The head of Yale University Press